Thank you, Al. And from neuroscience lab to the classroom. So the prepare now is for you. There's going to be one thing that you're going to need to write down and hold up. I won't really see it, but it'll be part of your interaction. So the next few minutes, you'll need something to write on and write with. Your phone is okay, your iPad, or real paper. So why stethoscope to seating chart? My journey is one of response to my patients. So about 13 years ago, I was practicing adult and child neurology, and there was a dramatic increase in my patient referrals. Significantly higher number of kids referred by their teachers for conditions such as attention disorders, ADHD, or I think this child might have an oppositional defiant problem. They are disturbing other students way more than is normal. They get into fights, they instigate obsessive compulsive disorders in young kids. Petit mal seizures. And these are wise teachers that I've known in my community for years. Yeah, because this child seems to be staring and blinking. And I know there's this petit mal seizure disorder where they do that. And so, in fact, these children were coming to my office for the referrals, and there was no higher incidence in the conditions. I evaluated them, and there was still kids that had it, but no higher incidence. So why was I getting so many referrals of these kids, but no higher incidence of the conditions? Well, as they were coming, the referrals were coming from the classroom teachers, and because I did know them well in a small community, I went back to the classrooms to see if there was any correlation between some changes in education that I hadn't been following and these conditions that were evident in the classroom. And as I started talking to teachers, they also said, before you make your opinion, why don't you take a look at what's happening in education? Because again, I had not been keeping up. And I just started reading almost anywhere I went about the overstuffed curriculum. This is even before you had everybody taking the test, but more information is being gathered, and it's being put into the curriculum. It was like, if it's data, put it in a book, teach it, and about a year later, test it. So the response to increased information was to overstuff the standards way, way back through the lowest elementary school. So I began to understand the problem. Then they let me go into the classrooms and observe. And what did I see in the same classrooms that my daughters had been in? So much directed instruction. Kids sitting there, even in first grade, in straight rows, not at table groups. There was very little student fun work with glitter and their own posters on the walls. There weren't little beans growing up in the windows, chicks coming out of chicks growing in their little incubators. It was a very different place, and the kids tended to be listening while the teacher spoke or writing things down. So it was much more passive. And then I started looking at the students in different classrooms, not as a neurologist, now looking at their behavior and who would I diagnose as a possible candidate for a neurology exam. And what I found, what I saw in terms of demeanor was boredom and frustration. The longer I stayed, I'd recognize boredom from the kids who seemed to already know have mastered whatever was being taught and were still being asked to do it again. And I saw a great deal of frustration, kids interrupting, I don't get it, before the words were out. So I noticed that was definitely a concern. So I started thinking, there's this behavior that others are seeing, and I get it too. I see this, they're acting out kinds of things. So let me now go back to my neurology and see what I know about the brain and why this might be happening. Well, we know based on fMRI scans that sustained or frequent boredom is stressful, and I'll show you what stress means inside the brain. We also know that sustained or frequent frustration is stressful, and this is in mammals and in human mammals. And the area that manifests highly, although stress reacts causes many problems throughout the brain. But let's focus on the amygdala. It's in part of that emotional limbic system, deep in the brain. There's one on each side. And I'll show you one study. But we know that this is a switching station. It's an area that when the brain is highly stressed or sustained or frequent stress, the amygdala changes in how metabolically active it is. And its job, one of the things it does, is the switching station. If it's not highly metabolic, information that enters the brain is going to be allowed to travel through the amygdala to the upper prefrontal cortex, the reflective brain. If it turns out the amygdala is in a state of high sustained stress, it blocks that direction of flow, and information is directed to the lower 80%, the reactive brain. So the switching station is modulated. Where the brain is processing is modulated by the state of stress. So in the state of high stress, with the reactive brain in charge, now with that, when I reminded myself of that, things fell into logical reasons what the kids were doing. Mammals, including humans, it's a really good thing for during a state of stress or confusion, I don't know what's happening. It's a really good thing that the brain, in that state of stress, directs input and output from the quickly reactive lower brain. An animal doesn't have time to ponder if the roar of that fox or that lion that's coming, that sounds nearby, is a big lion or a small lion, if it's very far away or moderately far away. Those decisions and what type of lion is it, that's for another day when it's not nearby. Information needs to be quickly processed and quickly reacted to. So we have 3 responses. Animals have 3 responses, not a choice. They're automatically going to, in that state of stress, go to the lower brain, and they'll do what they should do to survive. They'll fight, flight, or freeze. Humans have the same high stress turning, the same factor, high stress, sustained or repeated stress, also taking the amygdala, blocking flow to the reflective brain, sending it down to the lower brain. We just have a different version of fight, flight, and freeze that we were seeing in the classroom, the acting out and the zoning out. The behaviors that these kids were doing to their frustration, to their boredom, to their being unengaged, to their passive learning, was exactly how their brains are supposed to be, are designed. It's not a good thing, but it's the brain we inherited. That system in the limbic system is very much the same in humans as in the other mammals. So the brain's fight, flight, freeze response and the acting out and zoning out is not a bad kid. It's not even intentional. It's an automatic, reactive response to high stress. So misdiagnosis when the brain is not a problem is how I began to understand things. The oppositional defiant, they were fighting. They were doing things like that. The ADHD could be thought of as flight, making up their own things to do, getting up out of their seats, moving around, drinking water, playing with whatever they had with them. And then we had the freeze, those 3 cycles per second staring and blinking that looked like petit mal epilepsy, were zoning out because I did the EEGs that they didn't have. So fight, flight, freeze, and then we have the kids with obsessive compulsive symptoms, social anxiety symptoms. So this is not to say those conditions don't exist. They absolutely do. But they certainly didn't exist at the 5 to 10 times more frequent they were being referred to me. So that's when I made my life-changing pathway decision. I kept thinking of other links between what I knew from neuroscience and things that were happening in the classroom and what was going to happen because of the changes in education. So it didn't make logical sense, but to me it was a really clear pathway that I would stop practicing neurology, become a teacher, and apply what I knew and keep looking at the research because it was coming out so quickly and as we were getting more access to PET scans and fMRI scans. Look at what we're finding in the lab, be a teacher, and apply my interpretation of the research to classroom instruction. And that's what I did for the next 10 years in 2nd, 5th, and 7th grade. And so what I'll show you now is one example of, and I'll refer to this, that's why I gave you the background in the stress. I'll refer to the frustration and boredom and where I looked and how I found an intervention. By no means can anyone ever prove that what we see in a very controlled laboratory neuroimaging study is going to absolutely be the solution in the classroom. There is one thing is controlled, one isn't. But I just felt that I had the background and the time with students and the articles to read that I could look for correlations and try them out. So the example will be what strategies, knowing that there was a big issue of frustration and boredom, when are our kids least frustrated and bored? When are they most engaged? Video games. Okay, that didn't take a whole lot of research on my part. They love video games. So here we had that issue that I was concerned about, that when their brains were stressed by frustration and boredom, their reactive brains were, as is appropriate in our brain's design, their reactive brains were in control and they acted out and zoned out. Well, it was also causing problems. We're talking about not having prefrontal cortex influencing behavior. That was the acting out and zoning out. But what about academics? How is that boredom or frustration and stress, how is the failure of the amygdala to switch information up to the higher brain, how is that affecting them academically and cognitively? This is just one of so many studies, but it's a view of the brain from the feet to the head. And that would be the eyes there. Here's the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala here. And in this scan, hundreds of middle school students were studied. They were stressed by seeing some grumpy faces or pleasant faces. Then they were given a memory task. And the scans are done, and these are averaged. It's not painted on. Hundreds of scans are averaged together, and the area of highest metabolic activity is what's left when you subtract everything else. So while the kids in the scan are trying to remember the information they were asked to remember, in group A, which was later called positive emotional state, we can see activity in the amygdala, metabolic activity, use in this case of oxygen, as information is passing through it. We can see the tracts from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex, and we can see metabolic activity in the cognitive prefrontal cortex, where information turns into memories and is actively used. At the same time, in the activity trying to remember, in the group B, the stress state, we could see the activity hyperactive in the amygdala, and when things are subtracted out, minimal activity, minimal getting through to the thinking brain in the prefrontal cortex. And as one would expect, there was a 25 plus or minus 2% difference in how many they remembered in the unstressed compared to the stressed group. So we have double problems from this amygdala switching into the hyper-metabolic, hyperactive stress state. Information's not getting up to the thinking and remembering brain, and responsive behavior is being controlled by the lower reactive brain. So not only was the behavior problems, but I started recognizing, there's more than just how they're acting out in class. There's a whole other set. Why aren't these kids working as hard? I mean, I'd get these kids and they would give up very quickly, and they just didn't seem to have much confidence. And at that point, I was teaching 5th grade, and I transitioned into 7th grade math. But they weren't expending much effort. And research was out about mindset. But these kids were doing, again, exactly what the brain was designed to do in other mammals. Stop expending effort when there's low expectation of success. And in humans, repeated failure, called a fixed mindset by Dweck, after repeatedly not doing well or failing at a subject, a topic, a whole unit, the fixed mindset of stop expending effort comes to be in humans as it would in animals. So the belief comes that my intelligence and skills are predetermined, limited, and unchangeable, and my effort is fruitless. regarding that subject, in some kids, everything. So that doesn't happen with video gamers, though. In the video gamer, they sustain effort despite 80% failure. Nothing in humans has that perseverance. If somebody would get around 20% on essays or on their math tests for several years, they would have become fixed that they can't do it. The fixed mindset is great in animals because you do not want an animal to keep doing something where effort doesn't bring a goal. A fox has to learn not to chase prey that are going up that really steep mountain where every time he runs there, he loses the prey. That's a bad thing. He's going to lose energy and be in energy debt. So it's great the brain remembers that that effort didn't bring a goal, but again, we inherited it. So it makes sense that kids develop that mindset with academics, but why not with computer games? If they move, they choose, they fail 80% of the time. They persevere with challenge. They don't say, I don't get it, and walk away. And they use feedback to improve. Okay, this is great. We know the brain is capable of it. Now, what is it in the video game model that we can transplant into the classroom? I found 3 commonalities. Achievable challenge, chances to make predictions with immediate feedback on whether they're right or wrong, and feedback about their incremental progress. So can someone tell me the time? Because that's not how much time I have. Okay, this is where you're going to need your pencil and paper in a few minutes. But here's what I mean about the video game. When someone's playing a video game, they go into level 1, and this is like a level 1 to 10 game. They go into level 1, and if they have mastered, if they can already do the task, they go right to level 2. They don't have to wait for any other players to catch up with them or to learn something. They go right to level 2. At level 2, if they can still do whatever's required, once again, they go right to level 3. There's no waiting, there's no listening while someone else reads the instructions. It's you in the game. If they're at level 3 and haven't mastered it, now they're at the achievable challenge level. It's a challenge because they can't do it right away, and it's achievable because they know from experience it's a level 10 game, and they're not going to be asked to jump up to level 10. They've experienced games before. So it's challenge and achievable. There's prediction and feedback, because every move they make, even the fact that 80% of them are wrong, as soon as they make a move or a choice to do some action, they find out whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing to do, and the brain starts adjusting. And incremental progress. This is what happens when they're playing at level 3. They do what it takes, they get the feedback, they change, they finally solve it, do it right, have mastered whatever they needed to do. The screen changes, they're at level 4. It's surprising. There's an amazing chemical reaction in their brain, and yet you hardly even hear any whoops. There's certainly no extrinsic reinforcement. They don't get prizes, hugs, money. It's usually they're probably in their room late at night, and the parents, if anything, are angry at them for still playing video games, and they've missed dinner, and they're not doing their homework. Nothing external comes when you get to level 4. What they get at level 4 is harder work. Harder work. They did all that work, and what they get at level 4 as their reward is harder work. And as a matter of fact, if level 4 was not harder work, if it was kind of the same challenge but similar, but maybe different background, they wouldn't keep playing. If it was the same as level 3, they would have already mastered it. And this whole system is driven by a chemical that you're going to experience right now. And that system can be applied in the classroom to break the cycle of fixed mindset. So let's see if the pull of dopamine, dopamine is the brain chemical that surges pleasure. The pull of dopamine, when dopamine is elevated, you get some pretty neat things in the brain. Pleasure, decreased stress, curiosity, increased tension, motivation. In the time I talked about it, when stress is high and sustained or frequently high, you get some changes. Well, when dopamine is frequently or repeatedly high, the brain starts changing, and we find persevere, increased perseverance, and increased memory. So I'll show you a list of things that raise dopamine that we're not going to talk about now. What we're going to talk about is the powerful one in the video game model, the intrinsic satisfaction of making a correct prediction. And this is what I'm going to share with you. Dopamine comes out, showers the brain, when it recognizes that it made a correct prediction. So let's see if your brain seeks the pleasure of making a correct prediction. I want you to take your paper, and you're going to write down 2 things on your paper. One is to predict whether you would rather have 1 cent doubled every day for 30 days, the amount you'd have at the end of 30 days. The other choice would be, would you rather at the end of 30 days have $100,000? So that is your prediction. And you could write down the cent sign or the dollar sign. Would you rather have 1 cent doubled or $100,000? Now, part 2, if you don't answer part 2, it's like a hanging chad. Your vote doesn't count. On part 2, regardless of what you chose for part 1, write down your estimate of what the total amount would be at the end of 30 days if the 1 cent was doubled. So whether you chose it or not, you write down that prediction. So you're going to have 2 things on your paper, your iPod, when you hold it up. Your choice, the cent or the dollar, and your estimate of what that amount would be, $1 million, $10 million, $5, whatever. And when you're finished, when you have 2 things written down, hold it up, I'll acknowledge it, and you put it down. That's how my classes, I don't teach now, I teach you, but my classes, everyone would respond to every question, but through a clicker, a whiteboard, holding something up that I'd see, no one else would. But only the person who thinks learns. Only the person who bets cares about the answer. Okay, see yours, so you get to put them down. Got it, got it, got it. Yes, good. Thank you. Very good. This side, and that's cut. See it? And you see how I know wait time by doing this? Everyone's accountable. Nobody's embarrassed. And your brains made a bet. Predictions are more powerful on the brain when they're up to the level of a bet. So by writing it down and then showing me, you really raise the stakes on that bet. So that's the power of prediction. So I'm going to go on to the next topic, that of brain chemical equations. I see people shaking their heads. Is there a concern? What? You want the answer to the math question. Now, I'll remind you that I'm not giving you any money. And the answer is math, so it's exponents. Many of you don't like math. So yet, you really want the information. Okay, I'll show it to you first because you actually won't be able to think of anything else until I show it to you. Because I knew that you'd want to know your prediction, and there are no brain chemical equations coming up. Here you go. 5 million plus. So here's the deal. Can't leave it up because I want to conclude, but that's dopamine. The need, the brain wants to make predictions, not even when you know the prize isn't real. You want to make those bets because when you do, the intrinsic reinforcement of having your prediction be right just bathes the brain in dopamine. And it's worth it to your brain to be wrong, as long as no one sees, for the chance to be right. Cocaine works because of dopamine. It's an inert substance that squeezes out dopamine. It's very powerful. So in the classroom, the model for using this system to increase motivation, achievable challenge, frequent predictions and feedback, and awareness of incremental progress. I'll just give you one example of each and then conclude. An example of achievable challenge would be evaluating students' incremental progress by frequent assessments and the whole huge job of differentiating. But that's critical for why you need to differentiate. An example of prediction and feedback, you just did it. Holding up a response, getting the feedback. And finally, in the video game, awareness of incremental goal progress, not waiting weeks and weeks to find out if you're right. So you can go on a website, get free graphs, and they can graph their own effort to progress. They can also use rubrics and see where they've progressed. So In conclusion, a neurological success cycle or progression that I applied from neuroscience to this frustration and boredom, give them challenges and individualized challenges they could achieve, give them feedback on incremental progress toward that goal, and eventually it worked. They built that confidence and growth mindset, resilience, ability to persevere through challenges and setbacks, willingness to take increased risks, participate, more confidence, and not only participate, but creatively innovate. The brains they need to take with them for their 21st century. They opened the new pathways for their future and for ours. Thank you.